It was a cold winter morning, the kind of cold that makes you feel the chill deep inside your bones. Mark had always been a man of routine, up at dawn, coffee in hand, ready to face whatever the day threw at him. But that morning was different. As he stepped out onto his porch, the sight before him left him frozen. A bear, huge and unmistakably wild, was standing at the base of his doorstep. But what struck Mark wasn't just the sheer size of the creature, it was the two tiny cubs huddled together beneath their mother, their faces barely visible under her protective paws. For a moment, Mark hesitated. The fear he felt was overwhelming. This was a bear, after all. It could tear through his door in seconds if it wanted to. But what held him back wasn't fear, it was something deeper, something he hadn't anticipated. The bear wasn't here for violence, it was here for warmth, for safety. Mark's heart raced as he watched the cubs shiver, their small bodies trembling against the brutal cold. His breath caught in his throat, and an undeniable urge to do something, anything, surged within him. He wanted to help, but he was also terrified. What if the bear attacked? What if opening that door meant he was putting himself and his family in danger? But then, as if the bear understood his uncertainty, it looked at him, its eyes pleading for kindness. Mark's mind raced. He knew that his decision now could change everything, not just for the bear and her cubs, but for him as well. The door creaked in his hand as he reached for the handle. His fingers were cold, his grip shaky. He stood there for what seemed like forever, wrestling with his own instincts. But in the silence of the cold morning, a thought echoed in his mind: what if this was his chance to show that kindness, even to something wild, could make all the difference? And so, with a breath that felt like it could shatter the stillness, Mark made a decision. He opened the door. If you want to know what happened next and how this decision changed Mark's life forever, make sure you subscribe now. Trust me, you won't want to miss the twist in this story. Mark slowly pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest as he did so. The cold air rushed inside, and for a moment, everything felt as though it had come to a standstill. The bear, still standing at the foot of the porch, didn't move. Neither did the cubs. They were waiting, unsure, as if they too were questioning Mark's next move. Mark took a step forward, his shoes crunching on the snow. His breath was visible in the air, mixing with the smoke from his fireplace. His mind was racing. What could he do to help them? The last thing he wanted was for the situation to spiral out of control, but there was a glimmer of hope in his chest, a strange, almost undeniable feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. The mother bear looked at him, and for a moment, Mark could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in her eyes. She didn't growl or charge at him. Instead, she moved to the side, giving him a clearer view of the two cubs, their small bodies shivering with the cold. They were barely able to stand, and Mark realized how fragile they were in this harsh world. Mark took another cautious step forward, his hand shaking as he reached for the door, glancing back at the warmth of his home, the safety he had always known. But then he thought of the cubs again, their innocent faces, the way they huddled together for warmth. It wasn't just about the bear anymore, it was about the future, about showing them compassion. This decision wasn't just about opening the door to a cold, hungry bear, it was about opening the door to a world where kindness could change everything. His hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a second, he wondered if this was the right thing to do. He could hear the wind howling behind him, a reminder of how fragile life could be out there. Yet, a quiet voice inside urged him on. The decision to help wasn't always the easiest one, but it was often the one that mattered most. He stepped outside fully, his feet crunching in the snow. He walked slowly toward the bear, each step careful, deliberate. The cubs didn't move, but the bear's eyes followed him, a silent acknowledgement that she trusted him. She was trusting him with her children's safety. "Please don't make me regret this," Mark whispered to himself as he knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached for a blanket he had brought with him. The warmth from his house still clung to it, and he gently wrapped it around the cubs, who now looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. But the surprise wasn't over yet. As Mark looked back at the bear, he saw something that would change his life forever. The mother bear, who had been so protective, suddenly did something unexpected. She stepped aside, clearing a path for the two cubs to go inside. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The twist was clear. This bear, despite her fierce reputation, wasn't a threat. She was a mother willing to trust a human to care for her babies in exchange for the kindness she could never offer them herself. She wasn't just showing trust in Mark, she was asking for help. And then, in that moment, Mark understood. The decision he had made wasn't just about a bear at his door, it was about an opportunity to be a part of something greater. He was being given a chance to show that kindness could cross even the wildest of boundaries. Mark stood there, his body numb from the cold but his heart racing with a newfound sense of urgency. The bear had stepped aside, allowing her cubs to make their way toward the door. They were hesitant at first, their tiny paws tentative on the icy porch, but as they moved closer to the warmth inside, their pace quickened. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a simple moment, it was a decision that would change the course of his day, maybe even his life. He knelt down, his eyes locked on the two cubs, their small forms trembling against the cold. He gently ushered them inside, his hands shaking as he helped them cross the threshold. The warmth of the house hit them like a wave, and the cubs, feeling the comfort for the first time in what seemed like forever, huddled together, seeking refuge in the soft, dry blankets Mark had spread out for them. But it wasn't over yet. As the cubs settled inside, Mark glanced back at the mother bear, who was still standing in the snow. She hadn't moved yet, her eyes fixed on him, as if waiting for something, an assurance that he would keep his promise. He had opened the door for her cubs, but what about her? What would she do next? Mark's mind was racing. He knew he couldn't just let her stay out in the cold. She had trusted him, had given him the chance to prove that kindness could make a difference. But he had no idea what to do. Should he bring her inside too? Could he even get close enough to her without putting himself at risk? His instinct screamed at him to retreat, to go back inside and leave the bear outside where she belonged. But there was something about her silent presence, something about the way she stood there watching him, that kept him frozen in place. The cold wind bit at his skin, but Mark didn't move. Then, as if sensing his indecision, the bear slowly made her way forward. She was cautious, taking each step as though she was testing Mark's trustworthiness. Her eyes never left him. And that's when Mark realized it wasn't just about the cubs anymore. It was about this moment, about the way he could show the world that kindness didn't have to be something you reserved for those you knew. It could be given to anyone, even the wildest of creatures. The bear came closer, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Without a word, he stepped aside, making room for the mother bear to come inside. She hesitated for a moment, but then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she crossed the threshold, her large body filling the doorway. The house seemed to hold its breath as the bear stepped into the warmth. The once frigid air was now filled with the sounds of three creatures seeking shelter. But the moment wasn't over yet. The twist wasn't just in Mark's decision to help these animals, it was in what he learned about himself in that instant. Mark wasn't he just some guy helping a bear and her cubs. He was a man who had opened his heart, who had chosen kindness over fear, and in doing so, had found his own capacity for compassion. And that's when the real change began. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them all: Mark, the two cubs, and the mother bear. The contrast was overwhelming. The outside world, harsh and unforgiving, seemed miles away, while within the safety of Mark's home, it felt as though time had slowed down. Mark stood there for a moment, frozen, taking in the sight of this unexpected family that now shared his space. The mother bear, still cautious but visibly relieved, settled down near the cubs, her large body folding in on itself as she lay beside them. Mark, however, didn't he know what to do next? He had opened the door for them, sure. But now that they were inside, the reality of the situation hit him. He was no expert in animal behavior. What if something went wrong? What if the bear attacked, or worse, what if they destroyed his home? But there was something about the way the mother bear looked at him that calmed his nerves. She wasn't just any animal in need of help. She was a mother, and in that moment, they shared something more profound than words. The cubs, now safe from the biting cold, were quieter, snuggled up to each other, their small bodies starting to relax. Mark could see the exhaustion in their faces. They hadn't just been cold, they had been terrified. They had been out there in the wilderness, unsure of their future. But now, they had a chance. They had shelter. They had a future. As Mark turned to the kitchen to grab some food, he heard a faint noise behind him. The bear's eyes were fixed on him. Her gaze unwavering. It was a silent communication, a deep, unspoken understanding. She wasn't just grateful for the warmth, she was trusting him. Trusting him to protect her cubs. Trusting him to keep them safe. And for the first time that day, Mark realized something. He wasn't just opening the door to his house. He was opening the door to something far greater, an opportunity to make a real difference, not just for these animals, but for the world around him. He moved slowly, cautiously, so as not to disturb the bear or her cubs. But he could see that they were at peace, at least for now. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. He had chosen kindness, and in doing so, had broken down walls not just between himself and the animals, but between himself and his own doubts. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a protector, a caregiver, and a symbol of hope for something greater. Mark made his way back to the living room, where the bear and cubs were resting. He could see the mother bear's eyes flicker in his direction as he placed the food near her. She didn't hesitate, she began to eat, her cubs following suit, their little mouths nibbling at the food Mark had prepared. In that moment, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. He had done something good, something real. And the warmth in his heart was more than just the heat from the fireplace, it was the warmth of knowing that his decision had mattered. But there was still a part of him that wondered, was it truly safe? Could he keep these animals here until they were strong enough to leave? Would the world understand his actions? Would they see what he saw, the bond between a man and a mother bear, the unexpected kindness that had bridged the gap between species? Mark's thoughts were interrupted as he heard a sound coming from outside, distant but unmistakable, a low growl followed by the faint rustling of leaves. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The twist had just begun. The story wasn't over yet. The growl outside was faint at first, but it was enough to send a chill down Mark's spine. He stood still, his heart racing. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other wild animal. Yet deep down, he knew that growl wasn't a sound of peace, it was a warning. The mother bear heard it too. Her ears perked up, and her eyes shot to the window. Her body tensed, as if ready to spring into action. Mark's thoughts raced. The last thing he needed was for another bear, perhaps a male, to come looking for her. If that was the case, this situation could spiral out of control in seconds. His house, once a safe haven, now felt fragile, like a bubble about to burst. He had let the mother bear inside, and now, he had to face the consequences. He moved to the window, trying to peer through the frosted glass, but the view was blocked. The wind had picked up, swirling snow against the house. Mark's breath fogged up the window as he wiped it clean, but he still couldn't see anything. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps in the snow. The tension in the room was palpable. The bear stood up, her body rigid, as if preparing to defend her cubs. Mark's hands shook as he grabbed the kitchen knife. He wasn't sure if it would help, but it was the only thing he had. But then something unexpected happened. The bear didn't rush to the door. Instead, she walked over to her cubs, nudging them gently with her nose, as though reassuring them that they would be okay. She was a mother, and she had her own way of protecting them. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't a survival expert, but in that moment, he understood one thing. The bear didn't want him to fight. She didn't want violence. She wanted peace for her cubs, to be safe. And the more Mark thought about it, the more he realized she wasn't just looking for shelter. She was looking for a way to survive, to ensure her cub's future. And by letting them in, by offering kindness, he had become a part of that survival. The growl outside came closer, louder now. But Mark didn't move. He stayed near the window, watching as the mother bear remained still, her eyes fixed on the door. It was as if she was waiting for the right moment to act, knowing the danger was out there but trusting that Mark would do something. And then it hit him. This was no longer just about a bear and her cubs. This was about survival. About making the right choices. About what it meant to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. In that moment, Mark realized he wasn't just helping these animals. He was learning something about his own capacity for bravery and compassion. Suddenly, the door handle turned. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the growl anymore, it was someone or something trying to enter his house. He didn't know if it was the bear's mate or something worse, but the moment had come. Mark had to act. And he had to do it now. His hand hovered over the door, his mind racing, thinking about all the possibilities. But then, just as he was about to make his decision, the growl turned into a roar, a deafening sound that shook the walls of the house. The ground beneath him trembled. Mark's eyes went wide as the door burst open, slamming against the wall. What he saw on the other side wasn't just any bear. It was a massive male, his eyes wild with aggression. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment the door crashed open, Mark stood frozen in place, staring at the massive male bear. It was even larger than the mother, its fur matted with snow, and its eyes gleamed with an intensity that spoke of hunger, aggression, and a primal instinct to protect. Mark's pulse raced as the bear let out a low rumbling growl. His body went into survival mode, every nerve screaming for him to run, but he couldn't. The cubs, still nestled in the corner, were vulnerable. And the mother bear? Mark knew she wouldn't back down without a fight. The male bear took a step forward, its massive paws thudding against the wooden floor, but the mother bear stood her ground, positioning herself between the intruder and her cubs. Mark couldn't help but admire her bravery. Her sheer will to protect her young. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the future. And it was in that moment that Mark understood the depth of the decision he had made. He had chosen kindness, and it had brought him here to this dangerous crossroads. Mark's grip on the knife tightened, but his mind was racing. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be a way to stop the confrontation before it escalated further. But he knew that a human weapon wouldn't stop a bear like this. The wild instincts of both animals would overpower him in an instant. As much as he feared for his life, his thoughts were with the cubs. With the mother. With the animals he had opened his door to. In an attempt to save them, Mark had chosen kindness. And now, he had to face the consequences. But to his surprise, the mother bear did something unexpected. Instead of charging, instead of fighting back immediately, she took a step back. She lowered her head, her eyes softening as if in submission. It was as if she understood something Mark didn't, a way to negotiate. To show the male bear that they weren't a threat. She wasn't trying to dominate him. She was trying to survive. The male bear growled again, louder this time, and took another step forward. But then something incredible happened. The mother bear, without warning, nudged her cubs gently toward the back of the house, signaling them to stay hidden. She then turned to face the male bear once more, but this time, she stood perfectly still. Her posture calm. Her eyes locked onto his. It was as if she was telling him, "This is my family, I will not fight you, but I will protect them." And in that moment, Mark saw it. The bond. The language of survival that transcended human and animal. That defied everything he thought he knew about nature. The male bear hesitated. Its eyes flickered between the mother and the cubs. And then, to Mark's shock, it slowly backed away. It wasn't fear that drove it. It was respect. The male bear, sensing the mother's strength, her unwavering devotion to her cubs, realized something. There was no need for violence. There was a greater force at play here, one that Mark had discovered himself over the course of this strange, terrifying encounter, the power of compassion, of kindness in the face of fear. With a final glance at the family, the male bear turned, lumbering away into the woods. The door slammed shut behind him, and the house was quiet once more. Mark stood in stunned silence, the events of the past few minutes replaying in his mind. His hands still shook, but a deep, profound sense of peace settled over him. The storm had passed. But the true lesson was just beginning. He had opened the door to kindness, and it had opened a door to something far greater. To survival. To compassion. And to a world where, sometimes, love could conquer even the most dangerous of foes.